With the news of Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving wanting out of Brooklyn just 3 years after forming a super team and James Harden being traded at the trade deadline of the previous season, the Brooklyn Nets experiment has failed miserably, and it looks like they will be back into a rebuild or at least a mediocre to slight contending team depending on what trade package they receive in return for the superstars. With this in mind, I wanted to explore the worst super teams in history and see how they compare to the Nets in this experiment. Now, obviously, I did not want to include the Nets or this past season's Lakers team because considering the list, we already have a Nets team and we already have multiple Lakers teams. As you guys all know, these teams have done this multiple times before and it has not always ended up to be pretty for them. So that's where I wanted to explore, and that's one thing I wanted to preface with. And on top of that, I want to let you guys know that this list is not in any specific order. It is just multiple teams, and I wanted to explore and understand what went wrong and why they failed. If you do enjoy this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Turn post notifications on so you never miss a video, and let's get right into it. First up, we have a team and the first Lakers team on the list, the 2003/2004 Los Angeles Lakers. Now, this team is lower on the list just considering they actually did make an NBA Finals run. They finished 56-26, first place in the Western Conference, and they went through some good teams to get through the playoffs. They had some amazing talent on the roster: Kobe Bryant, Shaq, Karl Malone, Gary Payton, Derek Fisher, Rick Fox, and a head coach in Phil Jackson who has won multiple championships and has went down in history as one of the greatest head coaches of all time in NBA history, coaching the Lakers to multiple championships and coaching the Chicago Bulls led by Michael Jordan to multiple championships as well. Now, the backstory behind this one is a little interesting. The Lakers really did not have much to do in free agency. They didn't have much money left over, and it also looked like they might just want to run it back and hope to win another championship. But they shocked the NBA free agency and the NBA world as they obtained Gary Payton and Karl Malone, two aging NBA stars who will be future Hall of Fame NBA players, but very much out of their prime. They signed them in free agency, and obviously they're on this list, so it did not end up working out. Obviously, Kobe Bryant has always had a history of butting heads with his teammates, and internal issues were basically the reason this team failed. Kobe Bryant and Karl Malone especially did not get along, and multiple times Bryant accused Malone of making advances towards his wife, Vanessa Bryant. Obviously, we do not run with Karl Malone. We don't support him at all, so I would not be surprised if this was correct and true in Kobe Bryant's assumption. They did begin the season on a 20-5 run before losing Malone to a 39-game knee injury, but despite that, they finished their season on winning 14 out of their final 17 games, clinching the first seed in the Western Conference and also getting into the playoffs. The first round of the playoffs, they had an easy matchup against the Houston Rockets. They would sweep them, basically a 4-1 gentleman's sweep. Second round, they take on the San Antonio Spurs led by Tim Duncan, and obviously David Robinson was not there at the time, but Manu Ginobili is there at this time as well. So this was a good Spurs team they were taking on, and this series was highlighted in a 4-2 series win for the Lakers with a Derek Fisher .04 game winner, the quickest game winner in NBA history and one of the biggest moments in a playoff history, as we get to see Derek Fisher right here win one of the games for the Lakers after a magnificent comeback and an easy shot there for Derek Fisher. Now we move on to the Western Conference Finals, where they would win 4-2 over the Minnesota Timberwolves, and they ran into the NBA Finals looking to dominate a young, up-and-coming, unproven Detroit Pistons team in a harsh atmosphere. But this Pistons team was much more than expected. Led by Tayshaun Prince, Ben Wallace, Rasheed Wallace, Chauncey Billups, and Rip Hamilton, the Pistons beat the Lakers 4-1 in the NBA Finals in an embarrassing fashion. Malone would move on to retire, and Payton would leave for Boston, where he would float around between the Heat and the Celtics before retiring in 2004. Just the next season, Bryant would continue to butt heads with his co-star Shaquille O'Neal, and Shaq would be traded to Miami in return for a few young players and some picks. Bryant would be the lone star left in a shell that was left over from the former super team formed, and the team would slowly fizzle out into another super team that would be found later on this list. And the next team on this list is a bit of a controversial one as it spans across multiple seasons, but I wanted to include them just because of how much firepower they had over the years and just how little they did with it. The Lob City Clippers, an era that lasted from about 2011 to 2017 with about an overall record through those 6 or 7 seasons of 313 wins to 163 losses. Their key players and their best players included an all-star superstar point guard Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, who at the time was one of the better power forwards in the NBA, DeAndre Jordan, who at one time was a young up-and-coming star center and has since fizzled out into a normal role player and a less of a big role on his teams. But at the time, he was a dominant defensive force and an amazing lob threat for Chris Paul. Lamar Odom was another guy on a few of those Lob City teams, followed up by Caron Butler, who had some very productive seasons with the Clippers. JJ Redick was another sharpshooter who really made a living and got his place in the NBA with these Clippers teams. Jamal Crawford was on the team for a few years, and of course, they were headlined by head coach Doc Rivers, a guy who has a history of failing when it comes to the playoffs. In the 2010 season, the Lakers attempted to trade for New Orleans Hornets point guard Chris Paul. After the NBA owner Donald Stern vetoed the trade, considering it would create a super team, just a few days later, the Clippers were able to extract and create the assets to make a trade for Chris Paul and obtain him in return for Eric Gordon, other players, and a few first-round picks. One of those first-round picks would become Anthony Davis, so at the end of the day, it worked out for the New Orleans Hornets, which would become the Pelicans. But the Clippers would dominate for years in exciting fashion, bringing back what many would call a revitalization of the Showtime Lakers team. The Lob City Clippers were known for their famous and flashy dunks, which would involve Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan, and Chris Paul being the meister that would extract and throw the passes to the players. The struggles, though, began when it came to the playoffs. Multiple times throughout their tenure, the Clippers got so close to winning a series, blowing multiple 3-1 leads, even in their final few seasons, a 3-2 lead in the Western Conference semifinals against the Houston Rockets, where James Harden would dominate in 2 elimination games, and eventually the third, where they would come back and beat the Clippers in the series. Eventually, the Clippers would not be able to withstand the scrutiny, and they would have to reset their team, trading away Chris Paul to the Rockets. Blake Griffin would go to the Pistons after getting traded, and DeAndre Jordan would skip town for the Dallas Mavericks. This team fizzled just as quick as it came together, and the true talent on this team will never be revitalized, as they have not been able, any of them, to get an NBA championship. Chris Paul continues to be scrutinized for his lack of playoff success despite a finals run with the Suns 2 years ago. Will he ever get a finals ring? We won't know, but this team will always be remembered as one of the most disappointing teams in NBA history. The 2012-2013 Lakers is the second and last Lakers team on this installment of lists. They finished the season with a 45-37 record, and their key players involved Kobe Bryant once again, Paul Gasol, Dwight Howard, Steve Nash, Antoine Jameson, Metta World Peace, and Mike Brown was their head coach. The Lakers had acquired an aging Nash who was a former 2-time MVP and prime dominant center Dwight Howard in the previous offseason, but as quick as they arrived, internal conflicts began. Kobe and Howard did not mesh in their playstyle, and their egos quickly began to butt heads as Nash was not able to return to his prime self, being 39 at the time. His age began to show. Back injuries left Howard a shell of his former MVP self, and the Lakers barely scraped into the playoffs with a low record and a low seeding. Once they got there, it was not a good sight to see. The San Antonio Spurs, a team that for the next few years would dominate the NBA facing off against the Heat, swept them in the first round. Nash would retire shortly after, and Howard was shipped in a trade to join James Harden in the up-and-coming Houston Rockets. The Lakers were once again left with only Bryant and Gasol, and since that day they were not recover until the 2020 season, where LeBron would lead them to a bubble championship. This was a very disappointing one, as Dwight Howard had an eerily similar situation to the former Shaq, who was traded from Orlando to the Lakers early in his career in order to team up with Kobe and get into a bigger market. Unfortunately for the Lakers and Dwight Howard, it did not work out, and after the injuries, Dwight Howard would never quite be the same as his MVP self, and he really has just become a role player in this league despite his magnificent early season runs being one of the best players in the NBA. This could be the number 1 team on the list, but I felt like this, just because it was the Lakers again, I would include them at this number 3 spot. And at our second to last spot, we have another team that acquired Shaquille O'Neal late in his career and when he was hopping from contender to contender. The 2007, 2008, and the 2008-2009 Phoenix Suns teams had Shaq, Steve Nash, Amari Stoudemire, Sean Marion, who would be traded for Shaquille O'Neal at the midseason mark in 2007, Raja Bell, and they were led by head coach Mike D'Antoni. They would finish with a record of 55-27 in their first year forming the team, which is a fairly solid record. Their midseason trade to Miami was sending Sean Marion in exchange for out of his prime but still quality center Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq's final years were where he jumped from contender to contender, including Miami, Phoenix, Boston, and Cleveland, to name a few. Despite a relatively steady team chemistry and a quality head coach in Mike D'Antoni, the Suns just didn't have enough talent or enough young talent to get past the San Antonio Spurs in round one of the playoffs. They would be gentlemen swept 4-1 in the first round, and for 2 seasons total, they would have this super team, and both seasons they would result in a disappointment. 2009, they did not even make the playoffs, going into full rebuild mode shortly after. They would lose Nash in 2012 to the previous mentioned teams, the Los Angeles Lakers, and Amari Stoudemire in 2010 to the Knicks. Shaq would leave after 2009, where he would go on to play for the Cavs and the Celtics before retiring around 2011. This team will go down as one of the more disappointing teams, as the Suns had a bunch of young talent that they got rid of in order to acquire this team, and it pretty much put them in a bad place until just a few seasons ago in their finals run, and last year in their playoff run with Devin Booker and Chris Paul and DeAndre Ayton. This Suns team did not have much gas in their tank when they made it to the playoffs, and it showed with just how old their star players were and just how much they failed to do anything in the playoffs. While this final team definitely isn't the most star-studded or disappointing team in the super teams list or the super teams in NBA history, I wanted to include them last because, in my opinion, they had the biggest impact on their team. And you guys have to know who we're talking about at this point. The 2013-2014 Brooklyn Nets. Ironic because we're talking about the Nets right now in our NBA free agency in our current day. They finished the season with a 44-38 record, but that wasn't the biggest part of this super team. They had Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce, 2 former Celtics who they traded for, which we will get into in just a little bit. Both of them out of their prime, though. Darren Williams, another up-and-coming point guard who at one point was looked as better than Chris Paul when he was with the Utah Jazz early in his career. He has jumped around a little bit, but the Nets think he can still be a good point guard. Joe Johnson, ISO Joe, a solid quality starting shooting guard and small forward who has a chance to make an all-star team. Brook Lopez, still a young up-and-coming center who has not solidified himself on the Bucks just yet, but he is still the leading scorer all-time for the Brooklyn Nets. Also, a young or aging veteran, Jason Terry, led by a young up-and-coming Jason Kidd, who would have his first head coaching gig as a part of this Brooklyn Nets team. Now, this team would not be this low on the list if it wasn't the stuff that they gave up in order to get Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce. Just the offseason before, the Nets made one of the biggest mistakes or the worst trades in NBA history. Basically both. They would give up 4 first-round picks. In return, they would obtain the 2 aging out of their prime superstars. They gave up the 2014, 2016, 2017, and 2018 first-round picks. In return, they also gave up a few players to get KG and the truth, Paul Pierce. These picks turned into players such as Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown in the future because the Nets would be in full rebuild mode by the time these picks would come around. Garnett and Pierce were out of their prime, and these moves were quickly scrutinized by NBA media. Despite an above-average regular season, the Nets scraped into the playoffs where they would have a shocking 7-game win series against the Raptors in round 1, but round 2 you would really see where the age and the tiredness and the lack of mobility would come out as they took on a dominant Miami Heat team, and they would be embarrassed in a 4-1 series loss as LeBron left the Nets grasping for a win. Pierce would leave for Washington just that next offseason, and by 2015, other than Brook Lopez and Joe Johnson, the entire roster would be the same. Darren Williams was out of the league. Kevin Garnett was back in Minnesota for his final season. Johnson and Lopez would stay on the team for a few more years before they became quickly one of the lowest points and the worst teams in NBA history. It would take them almost 6 years to make a return to the playoffs and to bring us full circle back into the Kevin Durant situation we are at now with Kyrie Irving.
All right, the Nets looking to inbound. Jeff Green gets it into Durant. Here is Durant moving on Tucker. He turns, he shoots. Yes! With 1 second remaining. 1 second left. Durant hits a three. And Milwaukee has one timeout. They call for the timeout. What an incredible shot by Kevin Durant.
For review. Instant replay has confirmed the on-court decision is a 2-point field goal.
Gathers his feet. The question is, was his toe on the line? And it looks like from that angle, it was.